Okay. Lovely. So, hello everyone. I'm hoping you can all hear us well. So I'm just checking my phone in case one of our volunteers is desperately trying to get hold of me to say that our sound is not correct. As none of those had dropped into my inbox yet, I'm assuming we're all fine. So, Happy New Year everyone. So thank you for joining us for our first live session in 2021. And as you would already know from our social media posts, we have started the new year with the environment theme. Again, this was a topic selected by our audience, by you. So for those who are new to our platform, I would like to provide information about the structure of our Q&A session. So in the next half an hour or so, our first guest for this year, Sophie Gill from University of Oxford, will be answering our questions on her work that she undertakes at the University of Oxford. After this, we will have a 10-minute comfort break and resume back to get answers to your questions submitted through our social media accounts or through the YouTube channel chat function, which you can see on the right-hand side of the video. So our first guest, as I mentioned, is Sophie Gill, and she's an environmental scientist who focuses on finding new ways to draw atmospheric carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so we can sort of reverse the effects of climate change and global warming. So Sophie, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today, and thank you for sparing your time to tell us about your research. So before I sort of delve into our questions, would you like to briefly introduce us your area of research in layman's terms?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for the introduction, and also thank you for having me today. And I guess probably the simplest way to put what I do is that I examine the response of what plankton, so tiny microscopic organisms at the base of the food chain in the ocean, how they might respond to these schemes that have been proposed to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And specifically, the scheme that I look at is aiming to increase the ocean's capacity to absorb carbon dioxide and store it in alkaline materials.
Okay, great. So can you tell us a bit more about, you mentioned about carbon dioxide removal schemes. So can you tell us a bit more about what these are and why do we actually need them? I sort of touched onto that, but if you could please tell us a bit more about that, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So carbon dioxide removal is pretty much exactly what it says on the tin, to be honest. Carbon dioxide removal aims to remove carbon dioxide from the air and from the atmosphere and lock it away in a form where it won't affect the atmosphere anymore. And this is important because the primary cause of climate change is the increase in concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. For example, CO2, known as carbon dioxide, which has increased by more than a third in concentration since the Industrial Revolution, so when we started burning fossil fuels. And greenhouse gases block heat from escaping from the atmosphere into space, and this means the planet's heating up when we put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the role of the ocean in this, I guess, is that it absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, and when dissolved in the ocean, CO2 actually turns into an acid. And the ocean has absorbed between a quarter to a third of the CO2 we've emitted since the Industrial Revolution. So it helps to reduce warming in the atmosphere, but at quite a great cost to ecosystems because the acid's very damaging to marine life, which is why we see things like widespread bleaching of coral reefs, for example. We need carbon dioxide removal schemes because it's been recommended by various kind of bodies such as the UN, the United Nations, that to keep the damaging effects of climate change to a minimum, we need to keep it between 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius more than pre-industrial temperatures, so before we started burning fossil fuels. But we've already raised the Earth's temperature by about 1 degree Celsius, and it's been shown that even if we stopped emitting CO2 tomorrow, we'd still be on track for quite a bit more warming because there's a bit of a lag time between burning fossil fuels, the CO2 going into the atmosphere, and then the warming actually being caused. So we need lots of research to find some ways of actively removing that carbon dioxide that's already there, in addition to drastically reducing our kind of current and future emissions as well.
Okay, That's great. Well, thanks very much for that. So you mentioned that because of the carbon dioxide accumulated in the atmosphere, obviously with the rainfall, you get increased acidity in the oceans, if I get that right. So if that's the case, so do you see obviously the salt that we have in an ocean and in a small sea based on where they are, and in a, let's say, freshwater lake is different. So how do you think this acidity will actually affect? Is it the same effect in all of them, or are we actually talking about different effects in different types of waters?
Good question. So, first of all, the acid that I'm specifically talking about is not necessarily acid rain, which I think is what you mentioned there. It's more the acid that's formed when CO2 as a gas directly dissolves into seawater, and then it reacts with the water, H2O, and it forms carbonic acid. So it's related to, but not quite the same thing as acid rain. And it probably will have an effect very similar across the ocean. So ocean acidification as a result of the formation of carbonic acid will have a pretty uniform effect no matter where it is in the ocean. It's kind of damaging for marine life, like I said. In terms of freshwater, I don't know much about freshwater myself. I'm a marine scientist, so I probably can't answer that question properly. Okay. But I know that it's also bad if acid gets into freshwater systems. So
lovely, thanks very much for that. So could you tell us a bit more about, so you talked about these removal schemes and why we need them, but can you give us some examples about the schemes that are available?
Okay, so I guess the short answer is that there's many that have been proposed, ranging from land-based or terrestrial schemes to ocean-based or marine schemes. And there's several ways we could start doing carbon dioxide removal literally today, right now. We could use responsible reforestation efforts to help trees absorb more CO2. We could restore wetlands and mangrove habitats in the ocean, which are actually pretty enormous sinks for CO2. And then there's the hope of things called kind of negative emissions technologies, which is the area of my research that kind of covers. And numerous different strategies have been proposed, but these are things like direct air capture, for example, which is a scheme that directly aims to capture gaseous CO2, so CO2 in a gas form in the atmosphere, and store it perhaps in layers of rock underground. Or there's schemes like ocean alkalinity enhancement, which is specifically the scheme I work on, which aims to increase the amount of CO2 that the ocean's able to absorb and store it in materials that would reduce the acidity of the ocean, benefiting ecosystems like coral reefs. But the research into many of these negative emissions technologies is really still in its infancy. One of the dangers of recent net zero pledges we've seen from governments is that they rely very heavily on these technologies becoming a reality. And that we might very well have a kind of arsenal of schemes that we might be able to use, but it's not kind of well proven yet exactly how all of these would work at scale, for sure. But I work on the response of the plankton at the base of the food chain in the ocean to ocean alkalinity enhancement using lab experiments.
Okay, great. So so you mentioned also about, there are some materials that maybe we can use to actually reverse the acidification in the ocean. So what kind of material can we actually use, and how can you actually implement these material to these areas? Obviously thinking that ocean, it's an open space and it's not like a confined space that you can actually deal with. So what are the approaches as well that you are planning to implement with your research?
Yeah, so without going into the detailed chemistry too much, I guess the first thing to touch on there is when we say ocean alkalinity enhancement, we don't actually mean that the material is in itself alkaline in the sense that most people would think alkaline means necessarily. I'm probably right in saying that when most people think of the word alkaline, they probably think of the opposite of acidic, and that's kind of what it means, which is right. But the ocean property of alkalinity it's really confusing that they called it alkalinity, but it's basically related to the acid versus alkaline balance and pH. But it technically refers to the potential of the ocean to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which as I kind of mentioned before, is a natural process which happens to help decrease levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's kind of a natural feedback in the Earth's cycle to prevent like runaway greenhouse gas warming. Naturally, though, the product of this dissolution is carbonic acid, which we've discussed. But if we added certain compounds to the ocean to increase the ocean's alkalinity, we would increase the proportion of carbon dioxide which would dissolve in the surface ocean into alkaline products, which would counteract ocean acidification and decrease the proportion that would form carbonic acid, which, as I explained earlier, is very bad news for marine ecosystems. And the materials we might use to do this take their inspiration really from the geological carbon cycle. And over timescales of millions of years, weathering on land increases the alkalinity of rivers, which drain into the ocean and then increase the alkalinity in the ocean. And materials that we might use, going back to your original question, might be a mineral called olivine, for example, which might be a great candidate for increasing alkalinity, as it typically makes up a large proportion of naturally weathered material. And it actually makes up quite a large portion of the Earth's crust, so it would be readily available in large amounts. And any compounds similar to olivine chemically, such as calcium hydroxide, calcium oxide, or sodium bicarbonate or carbonate, they're commonly used in lab experiments to simulate this process too. So these could be a candidate, but they might not be available in such large quantities. And it's even been suggested that waste materials from mines that are rich in calcium aluminium silicate materials could be a useful source of this readily available material too.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. So I received a message saying that I'm a bit too not as loud as yourself, Sophie. So
Okay.
I'm going to sort of I checked my settings. I think I've got everything at the highest level possible for the microphone as well, and I'm going to try and talk a bit more loudly. So hopefully that will help. If it doesn't, please just let me know, and I will try to do something about it. So, so you told us about what type of material is available and how you're actually going to reverse the ocean acidification. So, can you tell us a bit more about where would these schemes would actually take place?
Yeah. So first of all, it's not actually been decided yet because there's not been enough research into this, which I definitely want to stress is what the subject area desperately needs, is that we need to get to the point where we have enough information that we could confidently make informed decisions about whether or not this carbon dioxide removal scheme could be safely implemented in the oceans. And the primary reason for that is we don't know the effect that this might have on biological organisms, which is kind of the motivation for my research. But we're pretty certain that it could happen in either the coastal or the open ocean, though. For example, when I talked about olivine before, it's been suggested that spreading minerals like olivine on beaches or in coastal waters could help to increase how much olivine would dissolve in the ocean, because wave action in those coastal areas could help to break that material up physically. Alternatively, finely ground material could be dispersed off the back of ships into the open ocean, or alternatively in coastal areas, but it might just make sense to make use of that natural wave action to achieve that. Or even weathering could be enhanced close to rivers or on agricultural land, which then runs into rivers, which would then eventually discharge into the ocean. So there's quite a wide variety of habitats that is being proposed that this could operate in. So I think we'll have to wait on the research to find out exactly where the best place to possibly do this might be.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. So you also mentioned about, when you're going to actually do these things and implement these materials with the hope of reversal of ocean acidification. Obviously, that brings to mind about the microplastic sort of pollution that we have in our waters, unfortunately. So do you think that type of pollution would actually interfere with what you're doing, or do you think they're two separate things and they shouldn't interfere at all?
That's a really good question, and actually not something I've ever been asked before. To be honest, I'm definitely not an expert in microplastic pollution. My initial answer would be that they're quite separate issues. So plastic pollution is quite a separate topic from carbon dioxide removal. However, there could feasibly be some interplay between I don't know, the dissolution of some plastics in the ocean, the compounds there, and possibly compounds that you might add to increase alkalinity. But I would not be able to confidently say that because I don't think any research has been completed on that at all. And they're generally quite separate subject areas, but possibly they shouldn't be.
Okay, great, thank you. So obviously you're going to go there and artificially you're going to try and restore what we as mankind has destroyed. So obviously you have got these schemes that you would like to implement, but it is going to be an artificial process. Have you done any experiments in the lab that just shows that these are actually safe for other wildlife, or is that not a concern? How does it work? Can you tell us a bit more on that?
Yeah, definitely. So that's like I said, it's one of the primary concerns with research into this scheme of ocean alkalinity enhancement is we know that alkalinity enhancement should work in theory, and it should allow us to increase the ocean's capacity to absorb CO2. But one of the biggest things we don't know is what the effect on ecosystems might be. Like you said, ranging from plankton, which I work on, which are microscopic organisms at the base of the food chain, all the way up to the biggest large mammals, for example, like whales. And to be honest, my research is probably a bit of a drop in the ocean compared to the entirety of the ocean ecosystem. I've just realised I said drop in the ocean. That's such a pun for this topic. But we're not really sure yet. We need more research. From the point of view of my own research with plankton, so far the two groups of plankton, which I'll probably talk a little bit more about later in detail, the ones that I work with don't seem to suffer any major adverse reactions to the enhanced alkalinity that I've worked with in the lab. But I have only worked with a couple of species, so we'll need much more research, maybe using controlled small-scale field trials called mesocosm experiments to see how these effects on plankton might affect the higher levels of the food web. And also this would need to be repeated with different species of plankton too. And I think there's some research groups going to be doing this soon, which is very exciting. And I actually, something that's just come to mind is that I've recently watched David Attenborough's latest documentary on Netflix, A Life on Our Planet. And I actually got the book for Christmas as well. So his big focus, what he thinks we should be doing, is rewilding the world. That's his idea for how we should be combating climate change, returning our biodiversity levels to those that are comparable to before the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. And I think holding on to that idea of rewilding is really important. And potentially a scheme like ocean alkalinity enhancement could positively amplify our impact on efforts to do this. For example, we've got published peer-reviewed research that shows from other researchers that's shown that coral reefs might respond positively to schemes like this. So I think my main message with this is that I would want to make sure that these schemes are being done safely, and you wouldn't do it if you thought that there was going to be an adverse impact on any wildlife. Okay,
great. Well, so when you were replying to this question, you talked about plankton. So obviously I'm not obviously, but I'm a biologist by trade, so I know what you mean when you talk about plankton, but there might be people who are not aware of this. So can you tell us in layman's terms what a plankton is and why it's important for the ocean ecosystem?
Yeah, for sure. So I've mentioned them quite a bit already, without really explaining what they are. Essentially, they're tiny microscopic organisms, so you can't see them with the naked eye commonly, although some of them you can. They're big enough to kind of see them if you had them in a Petri dish, for example, which are at the base of the food chain in the ocean. So they're like grass on land, so like that. They're basically tiny plants, a lot of them. So there's two broad categories of plankton. So there's the phytoplankton and the zooplankton. And phytoplankton are typically single-celled and they photosynthesize. So they're like tiny plants in the ocean using the sun's solar energy, the sun's rays to grow, and using the ocean's dissolved nutrients to power themselves. And when they photosynthesize, they take up CO2 and they release oxygen. And you probably commonly hear that the Amazon rainforests are the lungs of the planet, and they're what produces the oxygen that's essential for us to breathe. And it's definitely true that rainforests produce a lot of the oxygen that we breathe, but actually phytoplankton might produce up to 80% of the oxygen that's currently in the air. So the Amazon's got some competition. And I think it highlights the important role that many people don't realise these tiny organisms have for not just the ocean's food chain and other life on Earth, but us ultimately, because oxygen is something we breathe literally every second. And then the zooplankton are generally slightly bigger than phytoplankton, mainly multicellular, so made up of many cells rather than just one like the phytoplankton commonly. And they feed on the phytoplankton, commonly referred to as grazing, a bit like how zebras, for example, are often described as grazing on grasslands in the savannah in Africa. And I specifically work on two major groups of calcifying phytoplankton. So I know I'm introducing a lot of words here. But they're phytoplankton, so they photosynthesize, but they also calcify, which means that they make their shells or their body armor out of calcium carbonate. And these calcifying plankton are really important in the global carbon cycle, but they're also really important for the issue of ocean alkalinity enhancement, because the process of creating these calcium carbonate shells actually releases CO2 as a byproduct. So if the response of the calcifying plankton is that they might increase the amount of calcium carbonate they produce in response to enhanced alkalinity, then we could end up reversing some of the CO2 decreases we're aiming to achieve. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of one of the main kind of research avenues that I look at.
Okay, great. So when you were talking about plankton and how much oxygen it actually produces, so do you think we should have, instead of houseplants, plankton around the house to make sure that we have enough oxygen? So, as an air purifier, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I've never thought about that, if I'm absolutely honest, but I don't see why not. They are just like tiny plants. So, yeah, maybe they'll be the new houseplants in many years. They're probably not quite as pretty as a houseplant, some of them, but...
Yeah, great. Well, that's very interesting, though. I didn't know that. So when you are working with planktons in the lab, though, obviously to understand how and, in which ways they can actually draw that carbon dioxide back from the atmosphere. So what kind of experiments do you do, and how do you store and look after these plankton in the lab?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually did bring a couple of images, which I wonder if I can share just to show what the plankton actually look like, because I think they're very beautiful. So hopefully I can share some pictures here. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, I can.
Fantastic. Hopefully everyone else can as well. So I've mentioned that I work with two different groups of phytoplankton. They're a bit of a mouthful. So the first group that I work with are called coccolithophores. So it's a really long, complicated word. And then the second group I work with are called planktonic foraminifera. But I'll start off with the coccolithophores, because the two groups that I work with actually need caring for in very different ways. So these are coccolithophores. These are images of these are two different species of coccolithophores, which I've taken pictures of using an electron microscope. So you can't even use a regular microscope to look at these properly because they're so small. So there's a scale bar here that's 1 micron across, which is 1,000th of a millimeter. So they're very, very, very tiny. So you can't see them with the naked eye. And this is what they look like when they're in a flask, when there's lots of them together in a flask. So it's kind of all of them together kind of make up a murky solution, and they decrease the amount of light that goes through, and it kind of, the chlorophyll that they produce, so the kind of green tint to this is the reason for this color. But you can probably see here they have such intricate structures, which are made out of this calcium carbonate material I was talking about, and the variation between the structures for different species is really quite astounding. And it's a whole other area of research as to why they produce these really intricate, really complicated structures. But really, to answer your question, these guys aren't too fussy or difficult to grow. All they need is a healthy concentration of dissolved nutrients in the seawater that I put them in, and you can kind of just leave them to it. You inoculate some of them, so a word we're all a little bit more familiar with because of coronavirus inoculation. You put some of the cells into some clean seawater, and then they will just multiply and grow quite happily on their own. But by contrast, the planktonic foraminifera, even I struggle to say it, are very fussy and difficult to grow. So here's a light microscope image with a scale bar. This is 100 microns. So 100 1,000ths of a millimeter. So still pretty small. But here's a light microscope image of them. And then here's one individual in a jar, which you can actually see with the naked eye. So they're a bit bigger than the other ones I work with. And this light microscope image is actually 2 individuals of a species. And you can see their central calcium carbonate shell here. And that's surrounded by these radial kind of spines, which are also made out of calcium carbonate. And they're covered in bits of their intercellular material, which they kind of push out of their calcium carbonate shell, and that's really sticky along the spine, so that allows them to catch prey from the water column when they're in the sea, which is really cool. And they photosynthesize like the coccolithophores, but they also need to eat other plankton, otherwise they will die. So I had to hand feed them every day with a tiny Artemia shrimp larvae every day using a pipette, which was pretty arduous. So yeah, 2 different kinds of plankton, 2 different modes of looking after them. Oh, whoops. But that's the answer to your question, so I'll stop sharing there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. That's very interesting. So obviously these are very tiny sort of organisms. It's really, I can see how, but it's really hard to imagine how we're actually impacting on these sort of organisms. So can you tell us whether or not planktons are impacted by human activity, and if so, how?
Yeah, so the world's very interconnected, and plankton are definitely impacted by human activity at a broader scale as well, not just the 2 kind of main groups that I work with. So for example, ocean acidification, which I've spoken about. So this process where CO2 dissolves in the ocean and forms carbonic acid has been shown to affect plankton, and specifically the groups that I work with, their ability to calcify, as well as potentially leading to a dissolving environment for the calcium carbonate that they form. So that will be really bad. Also, pollution from our activities on land runs off into the ocean, and that might stimulate certain groups of plankton to overproduce, and this can be dangerous for both the marine environment and for us. So naturally, a phenomenon known as algal blooms can occur when a high concentration of nutrients occurs in surface waters, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And many plankton blooms are absolutely fine, very naturally occurring, no problem. However, sometimes if there's a high runoff of like artificial fertilizer from land, for example, something called a red tide can occur, where plankton which produce toxins can develop, which turns the water pretty bright shades of orange or red, which can be bad news for the food chain, and then for us as well, because it can get into fish stocks. So yeah, it can kind of, the plankton are definitely impacted by our activity, whether that's climate change or whether it's kind of agriculturally related or yeah.
Okay, thank you. Quite worrying actually. So hoping that what you're trying to develop or implement at the moment to recapture carbon dioxide is going to work. Is this an infinite solution? Can we keep doing this continuously? And whether or not we do it continuously, how long can we actually store carbon dioxide? Is there a possibility, I'm speculating here, that we have a carbon dioxide explosion from what we have actually captured with the methods that you're using?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So to start off with the first bit of your question, whether we would have to do this continuously, specifically focusing on ocean alkalinity enhancement, the idea would be if we can show that it's safe to implement it, we probably would have to continually, at some scale, add alkalinity into the ocean to continually replenish the potential for the ocean to absorb carbon dioxide, to kind of keep that capacity for absorbing carbon dioxide into a higher proportion of alkaline material. To keep that at a high level, we probably would need to keep adding material, which is why it's important to think about materials like olivine, which are very readily available, for example. But to be honest, we're probably not really at the stage where we could say whether that's a reality or not, because we definitely need to make sure that we've done the research into a wide range of ecosystem impacts, which we currently haven't. But for example, if we think about other schemes which are a little bit more researched, for example, storing liquid CO2 in rock layers deep underground on land, as long as there's no leakage, then we could kind of indefinitely store that carbon, I think is the consensus. And then for carbon removal schemes like land-based afforestation schemes, so increasing forest and tree cover, or increasing the cover of mangrove forests or seagrass meadows in the ocean, the main direction of carbon would definitely be a sink rather than a source into those areas, but you would have some exchange between the air and the sea or the forests. But yeah, in answer to your question, it very much depends on the scheme. But for ocean alkalinity enhancement, for sure, we're not at the stage where we could confidently say in what scale or how much or when it would need to happen.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much. This was a very interesting chat. So now we're going to take a 10-minute break. So our audience, so please make sure you submit your questions either through YouTube or through other social media channels that we have. So I will be collating these questions within this 10 minutes and we'll be asking these on your behalf to Sophie. So Sophie, thank you very much. And I've made you to talk for 30 minutes now, so a well-deserved break. So see you in 10 minutes.
Great, thank you. Great.
Right. Hello, everyone. We're now back. So thanks very much for your questions. I've been compiling them. So Sophie, obviously you have stimulated a lot of interest and we have got a good number of questions to go through.
Great.
So I'm going to start with one of the questions that's coming from the audience. So do heavy metals in olivine and the potential for bioconcentration in the food chain present a significant barrier for its use in So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely something that I was potentially maybe going to look at in my PhD, but I think I'm maybe going to run out of time a little bit. But it's definitely something that, which you nodded sympathetically there, it's something that happens quite a lot in research. So yeah, it's definitely a concern. And with olivine, I'm not aware that there are any heavy metals necessarily directly associated with pure olivine, but I possibly could be wrong there. But I think certainly where there are some schemes which aim to look at using mine waste, for example, which is a great source of readily available, already broken down, very fine material that would easily dissolve in the ocean. I think there's a risk that materials like that could definitely have some contamination from toxic heavy metals. So yes, definitely something that needs to be looked at. I probably won't get time to do it, but it's definitely something that needs to be looked at, probably mainly for specific schemes. So I've kind of tried to take a broad brush view with my research and look at generally what the impact of representative increases in alkalinity would have on the organisms that I look at. But yeah, if there's specific schemes that have specific materials that they have in mind for doing this alkalinity enhancement, that's definitely something they should look at, and it wouldn't be safe to do any schemes at scale without examining that, for sure. That's a really good question.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've got another question which we received. I'm not too sure if this is your area of expertise, but I'm just going to ask anyway and see, what your thoughts are. So, does protection of existing primary forests result in significant drawdown?
Okay. So yeah, definitely not something that I work on specifically, because I'm a ocean scientist, not a kind of terrestrial forest scientist. I don't know what the correct term would be, but I do know enough to say that primary forests, so forests that are very biodiverse, have a wide range of species in them. They're going to be better at drawing down carbon dioxide compared to some schemes that have been piloted by some airlines, for example, have promoted afforestation schemes. So, planting new forests, but they're all one species. Those aren't going to be as biodiverse an area as I think the term in the question was primary forests.
Yeah.
So yes, they will be better at drawing down carbon dioxide than these monoculture one species plants. So in that way, I guess they compare more positively. So yes, protecting something that already draws down a lot of carbon dioxide is going to be important for helping combat climate change. I hope that kind of answers the question. But
yeah, thank you anyway, having an sort of a go at answering it. So thanks very much for that.
No worries.
So in your talk, you mentioned about storing liquid carbon dioxide underground.
Yeah.
So how could it actually be removed from the atmosphere?
Again, probably not my specific area of expertise, so I don't want to overstep and give wrong information here. So to be honest, I'm not sure on the technicalities of exactly how that works. But I think the idea would be that you can either capture CO2 directly from the air, so CO2 that's already in the atmosphere from stuff that we have, from fossil fuels that we've already burnt. So we could directly capture that carbon dioxide from the air and convert it into a liquid and then store it underground, I think. Or the other option is scrubbing CO2 from like industrial power plants. So where the CO2 is going to be emitted from a big power station, for example, you could capture it in the chimney and then stop it from being emitted at the source. So rather than taking something that's already in the air, you could stop it from getting into the air in the first place. So I think those are the two kind of ideas that work in tandem with that idea of storing CO2 underground. But yeah, definitely not something that I specifically work on. So.
All right, great, thank you. So we have another question from our audience. So what creatures directly feed on plankton?
Good question. So sometimes other plankton. So like with the species that I work on, or the groups that I work on, foraminifera can sometimes prey on other plankton, although they mainly do like these Artemia shrimp that I fed them every day. But even Artemia shrimp are kind of classed as a form of plankton because because plankton is a bit of a catch-all term. So it basically means anything under a certain size bracket.
Yeah.
So if you're small enough in the ocean, you count as plankton pretty much. And then there's also really big organisms that feed on plankton. So filter feeders like basking sharks, which is something commonly seen around the UK and UK waters. Whale sharks as well. So even though they're really big, they feed on plankton, I think. And also whales. They feed on, or many whales anyway, blue whales feed on something called krill, which is, again, tiny shrimp, similar to the Artemia that I fed my foraminifera. So, yeah, even though they're really, really big, they ingest huge levels of these krill, so they need a lot. So anything from other small organisms all the way up to the largest mammal that we've ever had in the ocean, the blue whale. So huge range of organisms that feed on plankton, really.
Lovely, great. Well, thank you. So again, a question from the audience. So obviously they're thanking for this discussion. They really enjoyed it. They're thanking you. So how would you determine which plankton species to work with? How do you decide which one is best?
So specifically for my research, I guess I'll answer that in the context of, it was difficult to decide initially because there's so many plankton that I could have chosen from. But one of the questions we were really interested in was this issue of whether plankton that calcify, so forming their calcium carbonate shells, would possibly re-release carbon dioxide as a byproduct of that process, and reverse some of the aim of the CO2 drawdown from the alkalinity enhancement. So that was kind of the starting point for me. And then the two major groups of calcifiers in the surface waters of the ocean are the coccolithophores and the foraminifera. So they are two of the major contributors to producing this calcium carbonate in the surface ocean. So that was really where the decision was made. It was, they're two of the biggest players in this game, if you like, of calcium carbonate production. So that's kind of where I came down on that side of it.
Lovely, thank you. So so the next question from the same person is, how does the amount of rain that we get, say, each year, so sometimes you've got drought, sometimes you've got, too much rainfall, how does that impact, what you're trying to achieve and the whole cycle of the, of what we're observing in the oceans?
That's a really good question. To be honest, I probably don't have enough expertise on exactly how rainfall interacts with weathering to answer that properly. But I can say that anything that will increase the amount of weathering that's taking place on land. So I probably don't know enough to say that just point blank having more rainfall would do that. I think it probably would increase the amount of weathering, but anything that increases the amount of weathering on land will increase the alkalinity discharge into rivers and then into the ocean. So that's kind of the key point there.
Okay, lovely, great. And one of the last, I think this is the last question from the audience. So any possibility of your work, do you think it would actually involve pyrolysis or hydrothermal carbonization?
Okay, so I'm definitely not that familiar with those processes. So I can't say for certain. It's not something I've seen much discussion of in conjunction with ocean alkalinity enhancement yet. But yeah, I mean, everything's on the table for these emerging technologies. So if there is a way to potentially link those two things in a productive way that might potentially yield more source material, for example, might be useful. But yeah, it's not something I've seen discussed actually.
Okay, great. So I have got two questions, if you don't mind, unless we've
Sure.
got any other. Let me just quickly check if we've got any other questions from the audience. I think no. So okay, so what do you think is the biggest challenge for implementing this scheme?
Okay, well, so I think anyone who says that they could currently implement this scheme is wrong, because that would be very irresponsible. We're not really anywhere near the point where anyone should be advocating to do this at scale. We know in theory that this will work, and actually a lot of the logistical questions are starting to be answered, and the theory, like I said, is well proven. So this should work. But the major sticking point really is the biology and what will happen to the biology if we implement this scheme. That's probably the biggest barrier to ensuring that ocean alkalinity enhancement itself could be carried out, because we need more research. We need more research into how the biology will respond. We need more people working on this, and quickly as well, so that we can make an informed decision about whether this is a viable addition to our toolbox to reverse climate change. So yeah, and not just the science of how it would work, actually more on the engineering side, for example, how we can physically get more material to dissolve in the surface ocean. We need political scientists to kind of research how this would work legally in international waters, kind of interacting with politicians and different stakeholders, and also social scientists to guide us in how to ensure that public engagement is done responsibly and effectively. So that's just, I've just answered that in the context of ocean alkalinity enhancement, because that's my area of research. But to be honest, for a lot of carbon dioxide removal schemes, I think we need more research in whatever capacity it's needed for that particular scheme, because I think we're going to have questions from politicians in the coming years about how these schemes could potentially help us to achieve climate goals. And we need to have enough research behind us that we can, safely and responsibly answer those questions.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. But that sort of brought me into my next question. So, obviously, we're seeing a lot about climate change on the news as well. Obviously, there has been a big move from the Western countries moving their industry to Eastern countries or third world developing countries to actually look like they're doing better, even if they're doing, but they are also doing this movement. So when it comes to your science, though, and what you're trying to actually challenge, so how do you think politicians are actually affecting this process? And do you think that at any point these removal schemes will fit into, for example, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, or do you think it will fit into global climate targets, or do you think there will be too much politics around this that it will never actually happen?
Okay, there's some big questions there. And I'd just like to preface this by saying I'm definitely not a political scientist, obviously, but I think as someone who works in this area, I kind of have some thoughts on this for sure. And like I mentioned earlier, simply reducing our emissions has been proven that it won't be enough to achieve the UN or the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their internationally agreed climate goals, for example, that of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And I think a very recent report by Climate Action Tracker, I think it was, if I'm not wrong, I think I'm not misquoting there, suggested that due to recent pledges from China to be net zero by 2060 and the President-elect Joe Biden's commitment to rejoin the Paris Agreement when he comes into office, amongst other recent commitments to reach net zero, that based on these pledges, we should be able to stay within approximately 2 degrees temperature rise by the end of the century. However, it's incredibly important to bear in mind that, firstly, these are pledges, not action. So if the pledges are fulfilled, then this is very much true. But secondly, even 2 degrees of temperature rise will still result in sea level rise, more extreme weather events like wildfires and flooding, and further losses to biodiversity as well. So the bottom line is that the sooner we cut emissions, the better the situation will be. And I think if there's enough research into these schemes for us to, like I said, safely make informed decisions about whether these negative emissions technologies could contribute to helping with our climate goals, then I don't think there would necessarily be too much politics, as you put it, surrounding this, because I think these schemes are seen as a bit of an outlandish suggestion, and actually they're really not. They're something that could potentially work, but we just don't have enough research to make those informed decisions yet.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I've just checked whether or not we have any other questions, and I think this is it. And
cool.
Yeah, so thanks very much. We managed to finish it 4 minutes before time.
Oh.
Yeah, thanks very much for your time, though. I really enjoyed it, and I really myself have learned some new things as well, and certainly will considering getting some planktons as a house plant to see if I can use them as an air purifier. So
sounds like a good plan.
Yeah. So I would like to thank our audience as well. So it has been an absolute pleasure to have you all on board and to answer your questions. And if you're interested in the environment topic, we have got another live talk next week on Tuesday at the same time. Please follow us on our social media accounts or visit our website to learn more about this. And Sophie, again, thank you very much for your time, and look forward to having you again to get some updates on your PhD project and what you have achieved.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. And thanks to the audience as well. So, yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks very much.